Okay, we just finished talking about the media choices on, when you're trying to give good news, you typically do that where everyone hears it. If you're trying to do bad news trying to fuss at somebody, you do that in private. That kind of makes sense, right? So the rules for running an effective meeting, there were some pretty good rules in there, but I added one or two things that you might want to know about. The next one talks about email suggestions. That's pretty straightforward. What are the etiquette rules for doing email? The number one thing in my book is, my God, don't use reply all. I mean, very rarely do other people want to hear. If I blast out saying, okay, how many people here, I don't know, left their lights on in their car? Not me, not me, not me, not me, not me, not me. I don't need to hear that. Don't do a reply all to everybody. Okay, chapter 11 on risk. Okay, so the risk management goal. If you recall, the whole point about risk management is to manage risk. You don't really want to eliminate all risk. For example, I could build a car that could survive a crash going 60 miles an hour into a brick wall. I could build you a car that would have no damage whatsoever to the car. I could do that. You wouldn't want to drive it, but it could be done. So the idea isn't to eliminate risk, it's just to manage it in a cost-effective manner. One of the other things they talk about is in risk management is you don't ever want to spend more money on insurance, so to speak, on more than the thing is worth. So you don't want to spend $10,000 to protect an asset that's worth $1,000. Okay. Risk identification. It should be fairly straightforward that I have to identify the risk before I can protect them. If I don't know something exists, if I don't even know I have customers' credit card data in this particular database, where no one ever told me that there's a field in the database that contains information, I might, some vendor calls out and say, hey, can I take a look at your sales data? I go, sure, here. And I just give them the database because I had no idea it had sensitive information in it. Yeah, you need to know about that. The common risk sources. Remember we talked about all the different places where risk comes from? Cool. One of the classic ones is I don't have the right kind of involvement with management. I don't have the right kind of involvement with users. That is high risk. If I start a project where upper management doesn't want the thing to happen. By the way, I've done projects like this. I have done projects where we were fielding a new system where the old system was better than the new one being fielded, and so no one really wanted the new system. Yeah, those are painful. Okay, so there's a lot of risk in the problem of doing that. Qualitative versus quantitative. So I may ask you a question like, given this, which is this? This example, is this a quantitative or qualitative? Like, for example, you're doing that likelihood thing, like I have a 10% chance of getting caught in a hailstorm and a 5% chance of getting hit by a hailstorm. And, that. So therefore, how many dents am I going to have in my car? Which one is that? Is that qualitative or quantitative? Risk response, that's pretty straightforward. There are lots of strategies for doing risk response. The one that I kind of sort of like the most is the one where you do transference. It's like, I just don't want to do that. I'm going to give that to somebody else to do it. And the web is a classic example. There's an awful lot of risk in running a website. And so if you don't want to do that, just have it hosted by somebody else. Now, the risk does not go away. It's just that you don't have to do it. Somebody else does it. And there's other techniques you can use, but that's the one that I kind of like to talk about. Although that may not be the one that's on the exam. Okay. Where did we leave off? Yes, risk response. Chapter 12. So chapter 12 talks about contracting. So outsourcing. Everyone does outsourcing. Okay? Maybe not in the traditional sense, but everyone does outsourcing because I don't know any office environment that manufactures their own pencils or their own paper, right? We outsource the production of paper and pencils and pens and paper clips and staples and staplers, right? So everyone outsources. That's not the traditional way of thinking, but it is true. So what are the advantages of outsourcing? That's a good one. Now, in this context, we are talking about the more traditional view of outsourcing the labor part. Okay, the next one talks about procurement planning. And so you're in the process of putting together a plan, and it's got different parts to it, right? All parts of the plan. Well, I'm going to pick a scenario, say, where does this occur in the plan? Where do you decide, for example, whether or not you're going to do a procurement choice, or where are you going to have the make or buy decision? Where in the plan is that? And which is the next one, which is the categories of procurement. There's an awful lot of different ways you can do procurement. Some of them are designed to lower the risk to the contractor. And if you can overdo that, to the point where the contractor has no incentive whatsoever to control cost. You could overdo it. So we're talking about the cost reimbursable type. And so I may pick one of those cost reimbursables and ask you some questions about, what's the good about it or bad about it, or what's the incentives or disincentives. The difference between a request for proposal versus a request for quotes. You need to know a little bit about that. I'm going to ask you, which one of those is where you have an awful lot of work to do? And which one of those is pretty simple? Which one is all based on numbers? And which one has other things other than cost? Okay. Constructive change order. This is a tough one, because I mentioned in the scenario where some vendor is about to install this new system in your server room, and he brings in this little stubby 3-foot 19-inch rack, and you go 3 foot. All the rest of ours are 5 foot and they're black. Why are you bringing in silver one? The guy says, that's what I had. And so no, we really want the black one, 5 foot tall. So he goes off and buys that and then sends you a bill for the difference, because you have made a change to the contract by directing him to do that. The weird part about that is, in the government world, even though you're not technically authorized to alter the contract, in contract law you have altered the contract, which is why you personally can get in trouble. Stakeholders for 13. Remember this last chapter? It was just a week ago, right? Talks about how the communications with stakeholders basically has to be different. Some stakeholders are going to be for something, some of them are going to be against it, and I'll give you some scenarios. Identifying stakeholders. So you may go through and try to figure out who all your stakeholders are, and suppliers is a good example of ones you might want to consider, maybe not. But if your supplier is just providing you off-the-shelf stuff, all right, some office supply place that's providing you materials for what you need, well, then you probably don't need to include those guys. So there's some rules on how do you determine whether or not you should or should not include somebody in the stakeholder register. Competitors. Those are stakeholders, although you probably don't invite those guys to the meetings, right? Okay, but they are stakeholders. Although you probably don't communicate with them, they definitely have a stake in this, and most likely they're probably going to want your project to not succeed. I'm guessing. The stakeholder management plan. Yay. So remember, there's an awful lot of stuff in here which could be kind of embarrassing. It talks about, Bob is against this because, and that kind of stuff. So you get this is something that you don't normally put out in the public. The issue log. So anytime you're trying to track changes or track assignments of changes, so any type of issue that occurs, I often refer to a piece of software that I'm kind of familiar with, where you get a bug report or an issue, and you track it and you assign it to a person, and you go through all this stuff. If you can remember that whole discussion, you're good to go. Okay, the 2 extra credit questions. So, okay, I'm not going to ask you to do a tracking Gantt chart. That's not what I'm going to ask you to do. But what I am going to ask you to do is basically list the steps that are required to do that. Step 1, you do this. Boom, 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 boom. Just kind of describe how you produce a tracking Gantt chart. I'm not necessarily talking about, what button you push. I'm talking about conceptually. For example, in order to make a tracking Gantt chart, I have to have both the original baseline stuff. I have to freeze that data, and then I have to make changes to that data, right? So that the concept is I have to have data that's frozen and then data that changed, and therefore I can track the changes, right? Well, it's the same thing with earned value management. What did we have to do to produce an earned value management chart? Well, I had to have my costing data and frozen. I had to have my labor data and frozen. I had to have, just all the things that has to happen in order to pull it off. So I'm not talking about what button, although you could include that if you wanted. I'm talking big picture on what steps, what data do I need, and what do I have to do to produce these two things. Okay, that's it, ladies and germs. This is the last the last video for the entire course. So I wish you guys well, and perhaps I'll see you again in some future course.